In the British Museum sits a small, painted wooden panel from Khotan, an oasis kingdom on the old routes across Central Asia. At its center is a richly dressed woman. Beside her, an attendant lifts a hand toward the princess's headdress, directing attention to what the image says is hidden inside. The image is tied to one of silk history's most irresistible stories. A Chinese princess, married into Khotan, is said to have carried silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds with her so that her new home could make silk for itself. In later retellings, the scene becomes almost cinematic. A guarded secret, a forbidden cargo, a border crossed, and China's advantage broken by one act of smuggling. But the panel is not a police report. It was made later, after the events it claims to remember. The story survives because it meant something to the people who told it, not because every detail can be verified. And there is a deeper problem with the legend. Silk was never a secret that could simply be tucked into a headdress. A silkworm egg is not silk. A mulberry seed is not silk. Even a living cocoon is not an industry. To make silk reliably, people had to coordinate an entire biological system. The insect, its food, the season, the cocoon, the timing, and the handling. Then came reeling, and the trained judgment that separated success from ruined stock. That is what made silk so valuable, and so difficult to copy. Finished silk could travel enormous distances. The knowledge that produced it was much harder to move. And that difference mattered, because a kingdom could import shimmering cloth for generations without ever learning how to reproduce the chain behind it. So the real question is not whether someone once stole a few eggs. It is this: what exactly was China trying to keep secret? A silk cocoon looks almost weightless, but inside that pale shell is one of the most unusual raw materials humans ever learned to control. The domesticated silkworm, Bombyx mori, feeds on mulberry leaves. When the larva is ready to transform, it spins a cocoon around itself from a continuous protein filament coated with a gummy substance called sericin. That filament can extend for hundreds of meters before the cocoon is complete. This is the first reason silk became extraordinary. Many familiar textile fibers must be spun from shorter fibers before weaving. Silk begins as something closer to a single continuous thread. If that filament can be recovered intact, it can produce a yarn that is fine, strong, light, and capable of reflecting light with the unmistakable sheen that made silk desirable across courts and markets. But the filament is fragile in another sense. Its value depends on timing. Wait too long and the moth completes its transformation and breaks through the cocoon, cutting the filament into shorter lengths. Act too early, handle the cocoon badly, or mismanage the living stock that produced it, and the result changes. That means the material itself creates a chain of decisions. Someone has to keep silkworm eggs alive through the right season. Someone has to supply enough mulberry leaves when the larvae begin feeding rapidly. Someone has to recognize when cocoons are ready. Someone has to recover filament without destroying what makes it valuable. And someone has to combine many fine filaments into thread that can actually be worked. None of those steps lives inside an egg. An egg carries biology. It does not carry judgment. That distinction is the foundation of the entire silk story. A ruler might obtain silkworms. A merchant might acquire cocoons. A traveler might carry mulberry seeds across a frontier. But unless a community could reproduce the sequence again and again, through multiple generations of insects and workers, it had not acquired an industry. It had acquired a possibility. And that possibility was exactly what rival kingdoms wanted most. The secret of silk was not a single secret. It was a system of knowledge spread across people, seasons, living organisms, and repeated practice. Mulberry trees had to be cultivated. Silkworm eggs had to survive until the right moment. Larvae had to be fed as they grew. Cocoons had to be collected before the filament was broken. Thread had to be reeled and combined. Cloth had to be woven. But knowing the sequence was not the same as knowing how to make it work. A written instruction can tell someone what should happen. It cannot teach them what healthy eggs look like, how fast larvae should be feeding, when a cocoon is ready, or whether a batch is beginning to fail. Those judgments accumulate in hands, eyes, routines, and institutions. That is what makes tacit knowledge powerful. It is knowledge that can be demonstrated and taught, but not always compressed into a sentence. In silk production, this mattered because each mistake could damage the next stage. Weak stock reduced cocoons, poor timing damaged filament, bad reeling reduced usable thread. A problem that began with an insect could end as lower quality cloth. So protecting silk production did not require one locked room containing one formula. It could mean restricting who knew certain practices. It could mean keeping skilled workers close to producing communities. It could mean controlling access to breeding stock, host plants, workshops, or production. And because different periods and regions organized silk differently, there was no single wall around the knowledge. There was a boundary made from many smaller boundaries. That is why finished silk could circulate far beyond the places that produced it. Buyers could see the result. They could touch it, wear it, trade it, tax it, fight over access to it. But the cloth did not explain how to recreate the system behind it. And that gap between possession and reproduction is where silk became power. For centuries, silk moved outward from Chinese producing regions, long before the knowledge behind it moved as freely. That created a strange kind of power. A court in Central Asia could own silk robes without raising a single silkworm. A merchant in the Mediterranean could sell silk at extraordinary prices without knowing how to keep a colony alive. Empires could tax the cloth, display it, gift it, or restrict its use while remaining dependent on producers far away. This is where the word secret becomes useful and dangerous. Useful because historical sources and later traditions repeatedly treat silk production as protected knowledge. Dangerous because it can make the past sound like one government across centuries enforcing one perfect monopoly with one law. That is not what the evidence shows. China was not one unchanging political system. Dynasties rose and fell. Production centers shifted. Silk moved through tribute, trade, diplomacy, migration, warfare, and exchange. Knowledge could be guarded in one place and leak in another. So the real advantage was not absolute secrecy. It was concentration. For long stretches of history, Chinese producers possessed deep experience, established mulberry cultivation, trained labor, breeding stock, and institutions that could reproduce silk at scale. That meant outsiders could buy the finished material far more easily than they could recreate the system. And every bolt that crossed a frontier created the same frustration. The buyer could see the value. The buyer could even understand parts of the process. But understanding parts was not enough. To escape dependence, another kingdom had to do more than obtain information. It had to assemble biology, agriculture, timing, workers, tools, and repeated success in one place. The challenge was not acquiring a specimen. It was making a chain survive locally. That is why the famous stories of stolen eggs matter. Not because one theft necessarily destroyed Chinese dominance, but because they reveal what rival societies thought they needed to copy. And the next legend would test whether they were right. By the time silk reached distant courts, most buyers were seeing the end of a process they could not reproduce. The geography of the material made that imbalance worse. Fresh mulberry leaves are poor travelers. The silkworms need them where they are raised. Cocoons, too, are awkward to move before they spoil unless they are carefully handled. Raw silk is different. Once reeled and packed into hanks, it can cross enormous distances at high value and low weight. That asymmetry explains why silk workshops could exist far from silkworm farms. A court or weaving center might work imported thread beautifully while remaining dependent on growers somewhere else. The visible craft could move. The biological base stayed local. This separation between weaving and sericulture could produce a striking paradox. A city might have skilled weavers, dyers, merchants, and luxury customers, while still lacking the biological system that created its raw silk. Roman Syria had silk working traditions before Justinian's experiment. Sources describe imported silk being woven locally, and Procopius later names Beirut and Tyre as important centers of silk-related commerce and craft. Downstream expertise did not automatically create control upstream. So, for rulers trying to escape dependence, the problem was not simply access to cloth. It was how to reproduce the upstream chain. Mulberry cultivation, viable eggs, seasonal feeding, cocoon handling, and workers who knew when each step had gone wrong. And even planting mulberry trees did not create instant capacity. In drier regions west of monsoon Asia, trees could take years before they supplied enough leaves for substantial production. A transferred technique had to survive climate as well as politics. Mulberry makes the geography especially unforgiving. The leaves have to reach feeding larvae fresh, so the food supply cannot simply follow the finished product across the same long-distance trade routes. Sericulture therefore tends to bind insects, trees, and labor to the same local zone. A bolt of cloth can be moved by a merchant. A feeding season cannot. That makes the theft legends more revealing. They focus on the portable pieces, eggs, seeds, a traveler, because those are the parts a story can move in one scene. The harder pieces are the ones that cannot be smuggled quickly. A mature food supply, practiced judgment, and repeated successful cycles. The knowledge had to become local. That is the difference between carrying a secret across a border and building an industry on the other side. Because even if the princess carried living material, Khotan still had to transform that cargo into a functioning, repeatable system of local production. And nowhere is that distinction clearer than in Khotan, where one of silk history's most famous legends turns out to be less about theft than about what happened after the supposed theft. Khotan was not simply a place where a secret supposedly arrived. It was a place where a foreign production system had to become local. The famous princess story says that a royal bride carried silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds into the kingdom, hidden from the authorities who wanted to keep silk production inside China. Whether that episode happened exactly as later tradition described it is impossible to prove. But Khotan matters precisely because the history does not depend on proving that single scene. By the 7th century, the Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang recorded the smuggling tradition. Archaeology from sites around ancient Khotan shows that silk production was not merely imaginary. Finds include pierced cocoons, short silk filaments, and spun silk textiles, with some evidence predating the surviving panel by centuries. The chronology is revealing. The painted panel that preserves the princess legend is later than the earliest physical traces of silk production in the region. In other words, the story we can see was created after Khotan had already accumulated a silk history of its own. The image remembers an origin. The archaeology shows a practice. And those traces reveal something the legend hides. Khotanese sericulture appears to have developed its own practice. Buddhist sources describe producers allowing moths to emerge rather than killing the chrysalis inside the cocoon. Once a moth pierces the shell, the long filament can no longer be reeled intact, so the remaining silk is worked as floss and spun. Whether that practice came from religious principle, local adaptation, or some combination, the result matters. Khotan was not simply photocopying a Chinese workshop. It was making sericulture function under its own institutions and values. This also complicates the word copy. If Khotanese producers accepted pierced cocoons and spun silk where other producers valued intact, reelable filament, then successful transfer did not require every technique to remain unchanged. What had to survive was the capability. Enough biological knowledge, labor, and local routine to keep producing useful silk across generations. That is the point where transfer becomes replication. A technology is not successfully transferred when an object changes location. It is transferred when another society can keep the organisms alive, feed them, process the output, train new workers, and repeat the result, without constantly returning to the original source. The border crossing was only the beginning. The harder achievement was making the system local enough to survive the person who first brought it. That difference also explains why every later silk smuggling story should make us suspicious of the moment it claims victory. If a traveler carries eggs, that proves movement. If a ruler receives them, that proves access. If a workshop produces one successful batch, that proves possibility. But only repeated local production proves that the secret has actually changed hands. And that is the standard the Byzantine story will now have to meet. By the 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire still wanted silk badly enough to treat supply as a strategic problem. The court in Constantinople could buy silk. What it could not fully control was the chain that brought silk west. Procopius, writing in the age of Emperor Justinian, describes a moment when that dependence seemed vulnerable to attack. According to his account, monks who had spent time in a region he calls Serinda came to Justinian with a proposal. They told him that the creatures producing silk could be raised inside Roman territory. If the emperor wanted to reduce purchases from the Persians, they said, the solution was not another merchant contract. It was production. Procopius says the monks later returned carrying silkworm eggs. He does not give us the later cinematic details that became famous in modern retellings. He does not say they marched directly out of China with eggs hidden in bamboo canes. What he gives us is narrower and more useful. A ruler wants to weaken dependence. Travelers claim they know how. Living material is moved. And an empire attempts to turn access into capacity. That is why this episode matters even if every colorful detail cannot be trusted. Justinian's objective was not to own a few exotic insects. He wanted a supply system that answered to his own state. That transforms the silk story from a tale of luxury into a struggle over control. If silk had to pass through foreign producers, merchants, and rival political systems before reaching Roman buyers, then each stage created vulnerability. A domestic sericulture system promised something different: fewer external dependencies and more control over a material the court already valued. But here, the old problem returns. An emperor can order a project. He cannot order tacit knowledge into existence. Eggs can cross a frontier in a container. Skilled timing cannot. Mulberry can be planted. A mature production ecology cannot appear by decree. And if workers are learning by failure, then the first successful cocoon does not prove the system is secure. So when Procopius reaches the moment that sounds like victory, we have to ask the question the legend usually skips. What happened after the eggs arrived? Could Byzantine workers reproduce silk reliably, year after year, at a scale large enough to change the empire's dependence on imports? For good? The famous version of this story ends almost immediately. The monks return, the eggs arrive, Byzantine silk is born. But the historical record refuses to cooperate with that clean ending. Procopius gives one account. A separate 6th century tradition, preserved later by Photius, tells a different story. The carrier is Persian, not a monk, and the eggs are concealed in the hollow stem of a plant. Both traditions place viable silkworm eggs and mulberry feeding inside Roman territory. They do not give us one consistent heist narrative. Procopius says the monks had learned the process in Serinda and later returned there for the eggs. He does not identify the place as China in the simple way modern versions often do. The other tradition supplies the memorable hollow container, but gives the carrier a different identity. The familiar image of monks carrying China's secret in hollow canes is therefore a composite much cleaner than the surviving testimony. The details became sharper as later retellings fused them, and the bigger problem comes after arrival. A recent scholarly reassessment notes that there is no solid evidence of sericulture in Byzantium before the 11th century. Surviving sources also suggest that the empire still relied heavily on imported raw silk until at least the 10th century. That gap does not prove Procopius invented the episode. It changes what the episode can prove. This matters because Byzantium already knew how to value, trade, and work silk. The missing capability was further upstream. An empire could possess experienced textile workers and regulated luxury markets, while the raw silk entering those workshops still depended on distant sericulture. Bringing eggs west attacked that dependency at its biological source, but only if the new cycle could be sustained. Eggs arriving in Constantinople can mark an experiment, a beginning, even a successful hatch. They cannot by themselves demonstrate an industry large enough to replace established supply networks. This is the late reversal. The eggs may have crossed the frontier. The industry did not cross with them. To build that, Byzantine producers had to do what Khotan had done earlier. They had to adapt a living process to local conditions, train people, reproduce the stock, manage failure, and preserve enough knowledge for the next generation of workers. That takes time. It also changes what we mean by a secret. A secret can be stolen in an instant if it is a document, a formula, or a key. But silk production was distributed across biology, environment, labor, and institutions. No single carrier could hold all of it. So the most dramatic scene in the story may not be the smuggling at all. It may be the decades and centuries after the supposed heist, when people tried to turn imported possibility into local competence. The legend gives us a border crossing. History gives us a much harder problem. How do you make knowledge stay after the traveler is gone? The mistake is to imagine that once sericulture appeared inside Byzantine territory, dependence disappeared. It did not. A local industry still had to live inside an older silk economy that connected producers, merchants, workshops, courts, and consumers across enormous distances. Imported raw silk did not vanish because somebody had managed to hatch silkworms closer to Constantinople. And the practice itself did not remain frozen. Later Byzantine descriptions show methods changing over time. Procopius mentions warming eggs with dung. Centuries later, Byzantine writers describe other ways of warming them, including body heat and fire. The detail is small, but the implication is large. Imported knowledge was being absorbed into local routines. That is what replication looks like in history. The change is exactly what a one-scene heist story cannot show. A transferred practice is tested against local seasons, available fuel, household routines, labor organization, and the people who actually perform the work. Some elements persist, others are replaced. What survives is not a frozen recipe, but a functioning local version. It is rarely a switch. A new center begins with fragments, living stock, partial technique, workers with unequal experience, and methods that succeed under one set of conditions and fail under another. Then those fragments have to become routine. Knowledge moves from exceptional people into ordinary institutions. Workers teach workers. Failures become lessons. Successful practices become habits. Eventually, what once looked foreign can become local enough that the next generation no longer experiences it as an imported secret at all. But even then, independence is never complete. Silk production still depends on climate, plants, disease, labor, trade, and access to markets. One dependency can shrink while another grows. What changed over time was not that one civilization lost silk and another suddenly gained it. What changed was that the capability to produce silk became reproducible in more places. The old concentration fragmented. New centers learned, adapted, and built their own traditions. And with every successful replication, silk became harder to contain as a guarded capability, even while the labor and judgment behind it remained demanding. The secret was escaping. Not as a single object, as a system people had learned to rebuild again, under different local conditions entirely. Now return to the object that started this story. A strand of silk looks impossibly simple, but it is the opposite. Inside that filament is a chain of decisions that no emperor could steal and no traveler could carry alone. There is the silkworm, kept alive across generations. There is the mulberry tree, cultivated to feed it. There is the timing of feeding, cocooning, collecting, and reeling. There are workers whose hands turn observation into judgment. There are households, workshops, officials, merchants, and markets that make the knowledge repeatable. Remove one piece, and the secret begins to break apart. That is why silk could remain associated with Chinese production for so long, even while finished cloth traveled far beyond China. The product moved first. The capability moved later. And when that capability did move, it did not spread as a single stolen object. It spread through people who learned, adapted, failed, corrected, and taught others until a foreign practice became a local one.
That is why the famous stories survived. A princess hiding eggs in her headdress is easier to remember than generations of workers mastering a difficult process. Monks carrying silkworm eggs to Justinian are easier to picture than centuries of partial transfer, imported raw silk, local experiments, and uneven success. Legends compress systems into moments. History has to open them back up. So was the secret of silk stolen? Parts of it were transferred. Living material crossed borders, knowledge crossed with people. New producing centers emerged. But the deeper truth is more interesting. Silk was never one secret. It was a system. And the moment that system became reproducible beyond its older centers, the secret did not disappear. It multiplied. The next time silk catches the light, what you are seeing is not just a luxury fiber. You are looking at the memory of a technology that could travel only when people learned how to rebuild it.